Many self-employed people, and especially founders, deal with the small business regulation. And this small business regulation is by far not as attractive as it might seem at first glance. And to the vast majority of you who are self-employed, I actively advise against using this small business regulation. And why that is, we'll clarify in this video. And the first point is the outlook for the future. The perspective of your self-employment, because you can only take advantage of the small business regulation if your revenue in the previous year was under 25 €0 and in the current year under 100 €0. And at this point, a very important note, because I often see this discussion in the comment section under my videos, this is not about the first, second, or third year. Instead, you look at the previous year's revenue each year. And the revenue of the current year, that means you can only sustainably take advantage of the small business regulation if your revenue stays below 25 €0. As soon as you exceed 25 €0 in any year, you will no longer qualify for the following year starting January 1st. From January onwards, you are no longer considered a small business and must accordingly charge VAT. And with that in mind, you can consider how sustainable this really is, such a small business regulation, because these 25 €0 refer to revenue, not profit. Let's assume you make 25 €0 in profit and maybe also have, if you have operating expenses of 10 €0, you're left with 15 €0 profit. And from these 15 €0, you still have to pay for health insurance, taxes, and so on. So there really isn't that much left over. Maybe you can live on that for 1, 2, or 3 years at a student level. But if you live in a big city, if you have a family, then with the money you're allowed to earn under the small business regulation, you'll simply never be able to cover your living expenses. And in that case, it's better to choose from day one the options that will allow you to be self-employed in the long term as well. Because otherwise, later on, when you switch from the small business regulation to standard taxation, you'll face the huge problem that you have to inform all your clients. You might have to raise your prices, at least if they're business clients. Then your prices suddenly become more expensive. You might lose clients and so on. And for these reasons, I would choose from day one, or at least as early as possible, the setup that will allow you to run your business independently in the long term. And very often that's standard taxation and not the small business regulation. A second reason why I really don't like the small business regulation is the external perception, because you can't keep it hidden. Choosing the small business regulation. With the small business regulation, you do not show any VAT. And you also have to note this on your invoices. That means you write on your invoices, for example, no VAT shown due to the small business regulation, or no VAT according to Paragraph 19 of the German VAT Act, or something similar. That means, in any case, you include a note on all your invoices stating that you are under the small business regulation. And honestly, depending on what you're selling, that doesn't exactly make the best impression. If you want to start your own business now as a consultant, charging high prices for companies, and then you send out an invoice that says, no VAT shown due to the small business regulation. Yeah, with that, you've basically published your revenue, at least the revenue from the previous year, because your client immediately knows from your self-employment that you're currently making less than 25 €0 in revenue per year. And that already leads to you being perceived, at least in some industries and certain fields, as unprofessional, as a kind of hobby freelancer. And if you want to avoid giving that impression from the outset, that's also a reason to forego the small business regulation. However, if your customers are consumers, private individuals, then this factor doesn't really matter, because for private people, it's usually completely irrelevant what you write on your invoices, because they don't have to file VAT returns, and legally you actually don't even have to issue invoices to customers. That means they don't find out about it. If they find out, most don't care. In contrast, small business regulation has an image disadvantage. A reason I dislike small business regulation is lack of entrepreneur regulation. The missing input tax deduction. With a small business regulation, you don't have to show VAT on your invoices, you don't have to file VAT returns, you don't have to submit a VAT declaration, and in general, you don't have to pay VAT at all. But this isn't a gift from the state just because they're so generous. The state is actually taking away an option from you, namely the option to claim back the VAT on your incoming invoices, that is, on your purchases. Because there's one thing you should remember. Steuerfit, it's not necessarily a disadvantage, because Steuerfit also means you can deduct things from your taxes. And when it comes to VAT, that's especially attractive because you can For all your purchases, you can reclaim the VAT shown on them from the tax office, but you can only do this if your sales are also subject to VAT. That means if you choose the standard taxation scheme, you do this as part of your VAT advance return. You calculate the VAT that you received from your customers and offset it against the VAT you have paid to your suppliers and service providers. And in fact, if you have paid more VAT amounts to your suppliers, service providers, and so on, than you have received from your customers, then you actually get this money refunded to your account by the tax office. And this can be really attractive for founders or in general for self-employed people during investment phases. My favorite example is a taxi driver. He first buys a car for 60 euros and then starts driving with his car, and he earns a bit of money every day. If this taxi driver now chooses the small business regulation, then he has to purchase the car at the gross price. For 60 euros, that's about 10 euros in VAT. However, if this taxi driver voluntarily opts for the standard taxation, he can reclaim this VAT. That means he gets 10 euros refunded by the tax office for investing in a car. And he only has this option if he chooses standard taxation. So you can remember, especially during investment phases, often in the first years after founding a business, it can be very sensible to be subject to VAT and to deliberately forego the small business regulation so that the tax office refunds you the VAT amounts. And that brings us to the fourth point why I don't like the small business regulation and in some cases even consider it to be very dangerous. Specifically, you have a tax problem if as a small business under the small business regulation, you are a customer of companies that are based in another EU country. That means in any other EU country, for example, Austria or Denmark, or Luxembourg like Amazon or Ireland, for example, Meta or Google and so on. And you are quite often a customer of these companies. And that's where you run into a problem as a small business under the small business regulation. In these business relationships, either the principle of intra-community acquisition or the reverse charge procedure applies. Although these are different things under VAT law, the end result for you as a small business under the small business regulation in Germany is always the same. Both of these principles, these two rules, mean that you as the customer take on the VAT liability from the seller. For example, if you as a German company advertise with Google, then you have a business relationship as a German company with an Irish company. And then you receive a net invoice from Google for this advertising service. And then the invoice will say something like, this transaction is subject to the reverse charge procedure. And that means that you as a recipient of the service, you have to pay the VAT for this transaction, for this expense to the tax office in Germany. If you send 10 euros to Google, you must also pay 190 euros to the German tax office. In most cases, this is no problem because you can reclaim the 190 euros you paid from the tax office. In the same VAT return, you add 190 euros at the top of the form, and further down you subtract 190 euros, so you don't pay anything to the tax office, but you have reported it once. If you are under the small business regulation, you must do this. That means if you book advertising with Google, then you are required to file a VAT return and pay 190 euros. But because you are under the small business regulation, you have no input tax deduction. If you run Google ads in Germany as a small business, you must pay an additional 19% to the German tax office. The same is true if you advertise on Instagram or Facebook in some scenarios. For example, when you purchase products from other EU countries, such as on Amazon, in that case, it can actually happen that on top of the services you've already paid for, you have to pay VAT to the tax office again. Even though as a small business under the small business regulation, you actually shouldn't have anything to do with this. And a lot of small business owners simply don't know this. I've already made a separate video on this whole topic, which I'll link for you above. But if you have international business relationships as a self-employed person, I strongly advise against using the small business regulation. And that brings us to the fifth point why I don't like this small business regulation or why I find it unnecessary. Because you're probably not only a customer of international companies, but you may also have international clients. And then this small business regulation doesn't do anything for you because most of your revenue is Steuerfit anyway. That means, let's assume the other direction now. You're not a customer of Google. Instead, Google is your customer. That works pretty simply. For example, by publishing YouTube videos like this one on YouTube, you regularly receive money transferred to you by Google. And that's without value-added tax. And the same applies if you consult for a company from another EU country. But that's the case with most affiliate platforms and freelance platforms. You end up with clients abroad pretty quickly. And the revenue you generate from clients abroad is not subject to value-added tax for you at all. Because that's exactly where the reverse charge principle applies. Just on the other side, that means your revenues are tax-free anyway. If you now choose the small business regulation, you gain nothing, but you have the disadvantage that you can't reclaim the value-added tax on the cost side. So for everyone who works on the internet in any broad sense, this small business regulation almost never makes sense. If you have any questions about all these topics, then write your question in the comment section below, and I'll try to help you out. And if you say, oh my God, if I now waive the small business regulation, then I'll need an accounting program, then I'll need a proper professional setup. Yes, I would strongly recommend it to you. Subscribe to this channel and you'll stay up to date and know what you need to do. In the video description below, you'll find recommendations for accounting programs. I link them and link them here again. And now you could simply watch another video right after this one. I've already published 1 or 2 of them on this channel that you could watch now, this one or that one.